Hello and welcome back to another episode of App Stories. This episode is brought to you by Insta360. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Federici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. It sounds like you have been a busy person.
Yes.
Working with multiple Macs. Who would have thought that one day Federico Federici would spend half of his day, if not more, messing around with Macs? But we'll get to that. We'll get to that in the post-show for AppStories Plus subscribers.
I am coming to you from a different computer. I switched computers. We're going to talk about that in the post-show.
Both of us ended up doing some similar things over the past few days, so we'll talk about that in AppStories Plus. But today, we're going to talk about app intents because I feel like, to a degree, some of the information about app intents has gotten so far in the past now that people forget where we are, where things stand, and what's needed to get from where we are today to what was shown off at WWDC in 2024. But before we get to that, I do want to briefly touch on Xcode 26.3 because we talked about that last episode in the post show for AppStories Plus subscribers. And I had a little chance to play around with it, and I was generally positive about it. I think I generally still kind of like it, but I've run into some more limitations, and I know you had a chance to look at it too and had some thoughts. So I thought we would just do a quick recap of where we stand with Xcode.
Yeah, I was mostly disappointed by the lack of the latest OpenAI Codex models. Xcode 26.3 beta is still stuck on the 5.2 Codex models, and I really wanted to use the latest 5.3. It doesn't let you set explicitly a reasoning effort level.
Right.
You just kind of get like the vanilla Codex 5.2 experience with no thinking, it seems.
It's hard to tell. I don't know. I mean, yeah. I think you're probably right, but it doesn't really say one way or the other. And you're right that the same thing is true of Claude. It's not Claude Opus 4.6. It's 4.5.
Yeah. I just wanted to get the latest and greatest experience, and I just ended up having a better time with the regular terminal experience for Codex.
Yeah,
because then I get to set all the parameters and all the things I want. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to mention too that one thing that I didn't really talk about last week was the MCP server that also ships with 26.3. And what that allows you to do is you can work in the terminal and you can connect to a lot of things in Xcode. It's nice in that it's got extensive support for a lot of project settings and other things that the terminal might have, a lot of third-party plugins for terminal might have trouble with. It allows you to do those things in kind of a very official way. The downside is that Xcode has to be running. So you have to first open your project in Xcode, which is fine. I mean, you can do that and minimize it and continue to work in the terminal. Yeah. But it also gives you an awful lot of permission dialogues. Apple has gone kind of extreme on the permission dialogues, very similar to those early betas with the Mac when we first started seeing, more permission prompts. And that, I think, is just something that this is a beta. You can only... No. It'll settle down, hopefully. I think that they need to hit a nice middle ground. Maybe there should really be a web page that opens on developer.apple.com and lets you go through a bunch of checkboxes or something for the kinds of permissions that you're willing to give so that it's saved somewhere so you don't have this coming up every time you open a project. That it's just not a good experience when you have a lot of permission prompts like that.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Insta360. Now, you might already know Insta360 from their Action and 360 cameras. We've covered them on Mac Stories before. Well, they've taken all of that imaging expertise and brought it to the webcam world with their newest conferencing products. The new Insta360 Wave and Link 2 Pro, which is their flagship 4K AI webcam combo. I really love this tech. It's amazing. It takes up a really small bit of your desk space because the microphone in the Wave is a cylinder with a battery built in, and it's got all kinds of ways to connect to your computer. You can connect with the USB-C cable or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or a dongle that's included with the setup. And because it has a battery built in, it can last all day picking up your voice if you don't have the ability to connect with a cable. Then the Link 2 Pro sits on top of the microphone, attaching magnetically, and it can track you as you speak during a meeting, things like that, and it creates incredibly crisp, clear video, which I really appreciate. The Link 2 Pro has a large 1/1.3 inch sensor with dual native ISO and HDR, which basically means that you're going to get a really crisp, detailed video, no matter how dim your home office is, or if you're sitting in front of a brightly lit window, for instance. And it even creates that natural DSLR-like bokeh so that you stand out from your background without looking artificial. Then there's the audio, and this is where this combo really shines. It has a dual microphone system, both omnidirectional and directional, with AI noise cancellation and beamforming. You can switch between 4 different pickup modes, so whether you're in a noisy environment or if you're leading a team, you can use wide mode to clearly capture everyone in the room. It's kind of like having a studio mic built right into your webcam. And with the built-in Insight AI, you can transcribe, summarize, and even visualize your meetings in real time. You get a clean transcript and key takeaways instantly, and you can sync everything with tools like Notion in just a click. So instead of scrambling to take notes, you can actually focus on the conversation at hand and let AI handle the rest. It's a serious upgrade for creators, streamers, and professionals who want to level up their setup without adding a bunch of extra gear. If you're looking to elevate your video, audio, and productivity all at once, check out Insta360 Wave and the Link 2 Pro camera at insta360.com. That's INSTA360.com, or click the link in the show notes. Our thanks to Insta360 for their support of AppStories. So, Federico, today, with that out of the way, I wanted to talk about app intents because, as I said at the very top, I think that app intents have been around for a really long time, and I think I had been thinking about them a lot because we thought that we were going to get them with 26.4, the beta, and it looks as though we are not, and so they've been on my mind recently, and I think it's important as we start thinking about where things are going with smarter Siri and Apple Intelligence, that we kind of set down a marker and understand where this stands today, what app intents are capable of today, and what Apple needs to get from here to there, and there being essentially what they showed off at WWDC in 2024 and beyond that. So I don't want to get too technical about this, but I do think it does help to kind of think back a little bit about what are app intents, what do they do before we talk about kind of where they have to get to do what Apple has said they want to do, and what some of the the limitations and bottlenecks and problems might be in getting to that future. So
it all started in iOS 10, right?
It did. With SiriKit is really SiriKit was where this all started.
Yeah, it all started with SiriKit. At this point, that was gonna be 2016, I want to say. Yeah, 10 years ago. It started 10 years ago with the first SiriKit extensions. And I remember at the time, so it was my second time reviewing iOS annually. And that was really limited at the time. There was just a handful of SiriKit domains, which is sort of how Apple called the technology that allowed users to perform certain actions in Siri with third-party apps. And in many ways, that architecture, that domain-based architecture, sort of carried over to the after the workflow acquisition and the shortcuts inclusion in the operating system, then became app intents, and in many ways the same structure remained with this domain-based organization. And by domain, it means that SiriKit and then App Intents, they know some specific types of apps, right? They know what messaging is. They know what music
Right.
playback is. They know for example, requesting an Uber ride means. Those are all domains that were supported in SiriKit originally, and then obviously they were extended and then became App Intents. And App Intents are much more complex than SiriKit, but the underlying idea of we're going to organize these by domain, and then in each domain there's an app, and every app can support multiple intents, which means, sort of to simplify, an intent is an action that your application can perform via an extension inside of its sandbox, but outside of the main app running in the foreground.
Right.
This action can either perform something, it can do something, or it can retrieve something from the host app. And all of that is based on the Apple XPC protocol, which is the sandboxing protocol that you have on iOS. But essentially, the idea is you have the one central Siri, then you have the multiple domains that Siri understands, and within those domains, you have the app intents. Now, with Apple Intelligence, in theory, those app intents will be organized by schema, which is a separate conversation. But that's sort of the pyramid structure that we've been looking at for the past decade at this point.
Right. And it's interesting how it's evolved too, because originally with SiriKit, it was, the developers had to do a lot more to build this into their app.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now with the schema for app intents, it gets indexed. And it's available outside of the app. So when you first launch an app that you've downloaded from the App Store, that index is generated. And even before you open the app for the first time, you can find those app actions and things in things like Siri Spotlight. It makes it a lot easier and more accessible to get to those actions without the developers having to do the same kind of things that they had to do in the past. And I think that was one of the limitations that held back SiriKit back in the day. We had ride hailing, and I remember that being one of the very first ones. But it's changed quite a bit, and I think that structure is important to understand. So where we are today is we have the actions, which are pretty, the verbs, as the Apple likes to say. Those are the things that an app does. It's basically features. You have things like parameters, which are your inputs. You can do, as you said, you can also retrieve data, basically objects that the app creates. So think of an app like SQL, where maybe you've saved a video game that you want to play later. That object for a video game you've saved will have like the title of the game. It'll probably have the image of the cover art. It might have the release date. That is like a bundle of information that can be retrieved via app intents. And then you have the schema, which are categories of types of apps. And the reason this all exists is going forward, when we get to Apple Intelligence, the notion of this is that the large language models that Apple has, both on device and private cloud compute, will be able to recognize these domains, and then you as a user will be able to use natural language that will be translated by those large language models into a chain of events that take advantage of those actions which are within those domains, and presumably will then line them up and make them happen. One of the things that today you can do already, you can do chained events already, but today that's kind of limited to single apps. Like you can say, find me all my photos of Federico in Rome or something like that. And photos can kind of do that. It works sometimes, at least. And that's multiple actions within the Photos app. What's changing with Apple Intelligence is that Siri is going, and the natural language is going to be used to chain together actions from multiple different apps, all coordinated by the OS.
Yeah, that's sort of the idea. And I think what's also really interesting about the Apple approach here is that over the years, they have leveraged app intents to build a variety of features that are not the, it used to be the Siri integrations and then the shortcuts actions, but the same app intents power a whole host of functionalities across the system. So that would be some Spotlight extensions, but also widgets, for example. Widgets are entirely based on app intents now, and the WidgetKit framework is basically piggybacking off of the app intents technology. And so all of those, if you pay attention to some apps that offer both widgets and app intents, for example, I think Todoist would be an example, or Good Links even, you will notice that some of the configuration parameters that you have for a shortcut action are the same configuration parameters that you get in the widget. So the idea being that Apple has been telling developers, hey, you should really be using app intents over the past several years. And the idea would be like build it once, run it across the system. And we've talked about this on AppStories over the years, like the idea of what is an app anymore. Is an app an icon on your home screen, or is an app a collective of features that are sort of spread across the OS? And both things are true. You still have apps on the home screen, but you also have lock screen widgets, home screen widgets, shortcuts actions, Siri integrations. Those are all based on app intents. So Apple is hoping that by the time that Apple Intelligence with a large language model and Siri that understands, your personal context, that developers will already have done the work for those app intents, which I think is an interesting approach that only Apple has in the industry right now. The problem is that Apple doesn't have an LLM.
And that's a big problem, which we'll get to. I mean, it's amazing to me because even app intents even do, control things like the action button, the control center controls, and even when you squeeze the Apple Pencil to get a pop-up menu on an iPad app that supports the Apple Pencil Pro, that's an app intent too. So it really truly is like all throughout both iOS and iPadOS, and of course macOS in different ways itself. But the lack of an LLM is at the root of a lot of this, and I think that the approach has potential limitations in the era of LLMs and the speed at which things are moving right now that could make it hard for Apple to get to where it's trying to go and to keep up.
Yeah, I think the main problem is that the model that we have on iOS is putting the user, and the power user especially, at the center of it all. Meaning, I, the user, configure all my widgets. Those are based on app intents. If I'm a power user, I go into shortcuts and I put together a shortcut, and I take care of passing the data from one action to another and so forth. Whereas in the AI industry, we're used to having the LLM in the middle. Like the coordinator is not the user. It's the LLM that uses a variety of different tools, and mostly MCP. Now, we're looking at these agents that we've covered on AppStories, from Claude to OpenClaw, that are using native tool calling based on API calls and a terminal. But it's roughly the same idea, meaning the LLM takes care of orchestrating all of these different functionalities. And Apple doesn't have that sort of orchestration, right? The user has been the orchestrator for Apple so far.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that's a fundamental difference. And realistically, what Apple is taking so long to get right, going from a user-centric model, I organize my widgets, I organize my home screen, I organize my shortcuts, to the AI that understands all of those integrations. Because I, the user, I inherently understand the difference between a Good Links app intent or an Apple Music app intent. The LLM has no idea unless you give it instructions, unless you give it a proper schema, unless you give it a proper prompt, for example. And so that's the struggle, right? Because if I want to, I can, if I remember, John sent me this message, I have the intelligence and I have the skills to open messages and search. The LLM has no idea. The LLM needs to be told what to do. And telling the LLM what to do with a custom architecture like app intents that is not standardized for LLMs like MCP can be, or third-party APIs based on JSON data coming from the web can be, That's it. That's the challenge, I think.
Yeah, and I think it only gets exponentially harder when you have power users who maybe have dozens, if not hundreds of apps on their devices. Because let's say I've got 5 different photo editing apps and they all have a crop feature. And all of those developers implemented an app intent called crop. What's going to happen when somebody says crop my photo? Which app is it going to pick? That has not been explained by Apple yet. And that, I think, is a difficult problem to solve. Do you just go with the first one in alphabetical order? I hope not.
And also like something that we've seen in the MCP world compared to app intents. Sometimes I wake up and I open Claude and one of my integrations has a new feature, like Todoist as a new tool, or I don't know, Firecrawl as a new tool. And that's because those integrations can be updated server side. With app intents, the source of truth, so to speak, is on your device, right? Which is great from a privacy perspective because your data is in theory not going off to some cloud. But it also introduces other complexities where maybe an app is not updated and it has an old definition of the app intents that you want to use. And so it's a fundamentally different experience where you're still depending on the users and you're still depending on the App Store to update the applications that you have installed and to update the definition of the tools that you have, which can be solved, of course, and you can fall back gracefully on, maybe I have an older version of Good Links, but John has a new version of Good Links, and John has some app intents that I don't. And that's fine. And that's also something that developers have dealt with over the years. Apple introduced many years ago ways for developers to say this app intent is deprecated, you should be using this new one. You can see those messages, for example, in shortcuts. If you're using a shortcut with a really old action from a third-party app, it'll tell you this action is old, you should be using a new one. So all of these can be solved. It's just very different when it comes to this post-LLM world compared to the rest of the entire industry. Apple is just doing things their own way.
Yeah, there is an architectural issue too, I think, here, because the way Apple has designed this is that the OS is in charge and that the user goes to the OS and the OS then chains together the actions using the LLM, whereas one app cannot call another app. So what we're not going to get from this is the ability for Todoist, for Federico to be able to go into Todoist and say to Todoist, go get my reminders and import them into Todoist. That only happens with the OS and Siri in that chain. It can only happen that way. Now, you may be able to get to the same place in a lot of situations, but it is less flexible compared to, I think, the way MCP sometimes works.
Yeah. And so I really don't know. I mean, I'm sure that Apple, part of the reason behind this delays is that Apple has been trying to solve all of this, right?
Yeah.
And there were rumors a few months ago back, which we talked about Apple maybe building an MCP bridge for the LLM to sort of short circuit how the LLM can understand app intents running on your device. I think so. So my take is that overall, Apple has been building this sort of structure where you have groups of applications. Each application has its own groups of tools that can be related to each other and can be organized and can provide a schema for an LLM to understand. I do think that they have, conceptually speaking, the different pieces in place, right? I think it all comes down to the execution and how to make it so an LLM can reliably understand all of this with good performance. That's the other thing.
Right. I mean, I think the structure is there. I think you're right about that. But the problem is, like, for instance, because Apple's the gatekeeper of this, things like the fact that the schema are limited to 12 domains right now, that's potentially a big problem. I mean, there's no media playback, there's no messaging, there's no health and fitness. There are a lot of things that are, maps I think is missing too at this point. There are a lot of things that are missing. And with like MCP, anybody can create a schema and publish it and it can be used by a chatbot. Whereas with this, for anything to work, the schema has to exist in the first place. And that is going to have to, I mean, that's, we talked a little bit at the top about the 26.3 of Xcode not having the latest models, Apple's got to move faster, I think, to kind of roll these things out without falling further behind, because the schemas are pretty limited. And that kind of touches on another issue that I think might occur here, which is it's been so long since 2024 and so much has happened in the AI world that the expectations about what Siri is going to be able to do when it comes out are going to be even higher than maybe they were based on what was demoed in 2024, because people who aren't like really on top of this stuff like we are just going to think, well, okay, Claude or ChatGPT can do this stuff for me. Why can't Siri do it? And they're going to have to be a little bit of catching up in that sense as well, or else it's going to feel kind of underwhelming when it comes out.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what their announcement is like in terms of scope. When it was announced in 2 years ago, Apple put up documentation saying these are the first domains that we're going to support, but expect a rollout of more domains. I wouldn't be shocked if even the initial rollout is smaller than what was originally promised. Like instead of 12 domains, we have 6, and of the 12 original ones. I am really curious to learn more about the performance. What happens if your device is running in low power mode, for example? What happens on different types of devices? Like, is RAM going to be an issue for storing parts of this personal context on device? Like, is that how you're going to make that run on an iPhone 17 Pro Max versus, I don't know, an iPhone 16e, for example? Like, is the CPU going to be a bottleneck? Is RAM going to be a bottleneck? Or are you just providing to the LLM a series of tools and everything happens in the cloud and comes back to you? But then if that's the case, what's latency like, right? And that's not to mention the dual system that supposedly they have, with some parts of Siri still running on device and other parts of Siri using Google Gemini in private cloud compute. It sounds like a very complex system, and with any complex system, you introduce latency and you introduce bugs. And so, I don't know. I do think, again, conceptually, I think they have the pieces in place, and I think they have the developer ecosystem to pull it off.
Yeah.
Technically speaking, is my concern.
Yeah, I think, there's just a lot of technical hurdles to get over. I think another interesting one is, think about from the developer angle. If you're a small indie developer and you make an app that has 200 or 300 records in it, maybe you're saving things to read later or whatever it is, then, that's doable with App Intents, I think. What if you're Amazon? You can't really put all of your database into App Intents. There's no way that is too large. So there are like database interface issues, I think, for a lot of big retailers, whether it's a bank, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Uber. Think about Uber Eats. If you want to do an order, are you going to somehow donate App Intents for every single restaurant in like a metropolitan area? Probably not. Probably what we'll see from those kind of companies is like your local coffee shop maybe saves your favorite drink that you order, most of the time, and has a smaller database that then calls out to the big database. But I think as a result of some of those complications, you're going to see adoption more likely be centered around smaller indie apps than you're going to see it centered around big retailers and other large companies like that. And there's adoption issues there too with things like, what you're doing as a developer, commoditizing your app and donating your features to the OS to the benefit of Apple without as an equal benefit in return? I think like with things like widgets, where you can brand your widgets, you have a much easier sell for developers because you're creating more surfaces for people to get into your app. Whereas with App Intents, people don't have to ever go into your app. And that, I think for some developers, that's not a comfortable place to be. So I think my sense is that a lot of indie developers and smaller developers are in fact adopting these, which I think is good from a user standpoint. But I do think that there is going to be some convincing still that needs to be done by Apple to really bring people on board who might see this as a way of Apple kind of getting more of the benefit than they're getting.
Yeah. Well, John, what do you say we wrap it up here and we talk about the mess that we made with our computers?
Oh, I would love to talk to you about big messes because, boy, we did it.
Giant mess, yes.
All right. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for joining us to talk about App Intents. We'll have more to talk about this, I'm sure, in the future. Thanks to our sponsor, Insta360. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net and Club MacStories. And, of course, you can find us on social media where Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.